Welcome, everyone, to another episode of U.S.-China Dialogue, the show in which myself and my co-host, Professor Chen Dingding, talk to a range of U.S. and Chinese experts about different issues of potential concern and perhaps also more positive dynamics in the relationship. Dingding, nice to see you again. How are you?
Good. How are you, Neysun?
Good, here in Philadelphia, and you're in Guangzhou.
Yes.
You know, every time we see each other, we always update each other on the latest in U.S.-China relations. It's been quite a roller coaster as long as we've been talking, but there's even more that's happened since the last time we chatted. So what's your general take right now? How are you feeling in the current period after the new things that have happened, certainly on the U.S. side in recent weeks, including our diplomatic boycott of the upcoming Olympics?
Well, yeah, a lot has happened since our last episode, but I think overall, I think it's not being too surprising for us, as we have discussed before. You know, there are issues that can be, competitive. There are issues that can be cooperative. And they're both positive signs and maybe some negative signs, but that seems to be the pattern now going into next year, 2022. So, but I hope very soon, for example, the U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, can arrive in China very quickly to start his job.
That's right. We're finally sending you an ambassador. Just yesterday was finally confirmed. So that's a good step. And, on this idea of there being some areas of maybe more cooperative dynamics, the area that is most often foregrounded as where that can be possible is the area environment, and in particular climate, which of course is our theme for today. So why don't we get started with our great panelists? Let's invite them to join us up on stage and introduce them to all of you.
Excellent. I will introduce our American colleagues first. First, we have Professor Deborah Seligsohn, who is an assistant professor at Villanova, also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's also the former science counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and a former senior advisor to the World Resources Institute China Energy and Climate Program in Beijing. Welcome, Deborah. Also, we have Scott Moore, who is a political scientist whose interests center on environmental sustainability, technology, and international relations. And his first book, Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict Cooperation and Institutional Building in Shared River Basins, came out from Oxford University Press in 2018. And Dr. Moore was a young professional and water resources management specialist at the World Bank Group and environment, science, technology, and health officer for China at the U.S. Department of State, where he worked extensively on the Paris Agreement on climate change. Welcome, Scott.
And on the Chinese side, we have Professor Li Xinlei from the School of Political Science and Public Administration of the Environmental, and the director of the Environmental Politics Institute at Shandong University. She is a graduate of the Environmental Policy Research Center of the Free University of Berlin in Germany. She's been engaged in environmental and energy governance research, focusing on global climate governance, clean energy diplomacy, international public crisis governance, and other fields. She's authored multiple books, published multiple journals, papers in academic journals on these topics, and we're thrilled to have her with us today. We also have Professor Teng Fei from the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University, where he's also the deputy director of the Tsinghua-Berkeley Joint Research Center on Energy and Climate. He's the lead author of the IPCC's fifth assessment report. In WG3, he is the lead author of the second and the third China's National Assessment Report on Climate Change, and a member of the drafting team for several key national documents, including the National Plan on Climate Change and White Paper on Climate Change. He, in addition to all of this work, has generally served as an advisory expert for China's negotiation team on mitigation and transparency under UNFCCC for many years. And we are also thrilled to have him. Welcome, everyone. This is a fantastic group of experts on both sides. And so why don't we jump into the conversation? And I think the place that probably makes the most sense to start is to reflect on what was achieved at Glasgow a month ago about, and in particular to focus in on this joint statement from the US and China on various steps that the two countries can take, including together on mitigation of the causes of climate change. Why don't we just start by asking each of you to reflect a bit on what you thought the significance of that statement was and its contents, and then we'll go from there. Why don't I invite Deb to go first?
Thanks. I would always defer to Professor Tung, who has actually been on these negotiating teams. I've been working around the fringes of the COP for a number of years, but I've never actually been on a negotiating team. But have worked on a lot of US-China agreements. What I would say firstly is that I think a lot more was achieved at Glasgow than people have generally recognized. I think this whole approach of having pledges where different countries signed on to real aspirational goals. The challenge of a typical UN agreement is that it becomes the least common denominator because there's consensus. Everybody has to agree. Whereas the different pledges, people really said, this is what we're going for. And I think in terms of US-China, they both signed on to this forestry pledge where both countries are major consumers from deforested land, and both countries committed to use domestic law as they have on wood, but not on the products that then come from deforested land. This would require new law, certainly in the US, and I believe in China. So they really did commit to some new things, even within this pledge framework. They also conspicuously didn't commit to certain other things, particularly the coal pledge. And I think that gives activists some opportunities for naming and shaming both countries heading forward. But there are many different ways to use these agreements. But then when we get to the bilateral agreement, first of all, it cleared up some spots where the pledging didn't include both countries, most especially on methane, where China didn't sign on to the pledge, but committed to specific things. And both countries committed to really pushing toward the 1.5 degree goal. Now, keeping warming within 1.5 as opposed to the 2 degrees originally agreed to at Copenhagen a dozen years ago. And the other thing is, while 1.5 hasn't been enshrined as the only goal at Glasgow, I mean, the growing consensus, the feeling within the meeting is that we really have to get there because, well, we're living with climate change right now and we're at 1.1 degrees. So we know how bad. I think much more than, 20, 30 years ago when I started working on these issues, people feel climate change. So I think the bilateral agreement is important, and it lists a range of issues, and it recognized that we have a shared goal. And that's really important. I think, you started with US-China relations, and there's been a tendency to claim that we don't agree on anything, and that's just not true. And climate change is one of these issues, along with air pollution, along with public health, where our goals are exactly the same. I'll stop there.
Great, Deb. Thank you. And why don't we take up your invitation and turn next to Tengfei. You have been, as Deb said, very involved in these COP26 meetings over years. So how do you assess the last meeting and this joint statement?
Thank you, Nathan. I think that joint announcement is very important in terms of several aspects. Firstly, it has been a tradition that once the international negotiations are facing some important times to make decisions, the joint announcement between China and the US will inject momentum and to send strong signal to other countries that we are willing to make things done. I think this is also the same case for Copenhagen. Just the same issues also happens in Paris about 6 years ago. As the two biggest emitters and also the two biggest powerhouses for the climate change action, I think through this joint announcement, China and the US show the willingness to work together and to move the global climate negotiation process forward. That is one of the important reasons that why we can make success in Glasgow this year. And secondly, I think that I agree with Debbie that this is also not only important for multilateral process, but also for both China and the US within a bilateral context, given that the existing and ongoing tension between the two countries. Through this joint announcement, it shows that those two countries, although are competing each other in many areas, but they can work together, and especially in the climate change, to provide the global public goods that to the whole world. That is also important, that to show the cooperation within the context of many competition. And thirdly, I think that the importance of these announcements also reflects through that two countries build upon their previous cooperation in April this year, and they listed some concrete areas they can work together, and especially as Debbie mentioned, that machine and also some technology areas, including the carbon capture and storage. Those will shed light on the future concrete action among those two countries, and through those concrete action, the two countries will provide the technology solution to the whole world. And last but not least is this agreement also establish some institutions, that is the working group between China and the US. And through this institution arrangement, those two countries can establish a channel to interact each other. And through this, they can generate more opportunity and space to cooperation in the future. I'll stop here.
Thank you. And you mentioned the earlier Paris negotiations and agreement. Of course, one of the key figures in that was then Secretary of State John Kerry, who's now the President Biden's chief climate negotiator. Scott, you actually were working for John Kerry at the time of the Paris agreements, and you were very involved in that whole period of the U.S. government sort of lead up to that. So I'm very curious now to turn to you. How do you, given that background that you have, how did you see your former boss John Kerry's work at Glasgow and this joint statement that he was able to achieve?
Well, thanks, Nathan. And I do think, as your question implies, that the fact that Secretary Kerry was sort of leading the U.S. delegation and Xie Jinhua was leading the Chinese delegation was very significant, just in terms of their personal history and their personalities. That's something maybe we can talk a little bit more about later on. But I think certainly that played a role in this joint declaration, which frankly, not everyone was expecting, and in that sense came as something of a pleasant surprise. I would add to what my fellow panelists have said in that I think you can look at it in two ways. In terms of its symbolic kind of significance for diplomacy and geopolitics, and then also in terms of its substantive impact on emissions. And in some ways, I think the symbolic importance is just as remarkable in that, as has been mentioned already, what the joint declaration does is signal against the backdrop of continually worsening U.S.-China relations that both sides have, in a sense, committed to trying to sort of preserve, to some degree, climate change as an area of cooperation, and in particular by extending this tradition, and it is now a tradition. There have been now 3 of these sort of U.S.-China joint statements or agreements or declarations coincident with major climate change negotiations. And it's particularly notable that both sides decided to extend this tradition despite the really rapidly worsening environment in the broader bilateral relationship. I would also say that in the context of the multilateral negotiations themselves, this declaration is very important and symbolic in that it kind of restores the image, which was very prominent, especially during the Obama administration, of there sort of being a US-China motor under the hood of the multilateral climate negotiations. And this, the joint declaration, to some degree restored, I think, that image, or at least that aspiration before the world. I would just briefly maybe touch on the substance, and there, much remains to be seen in terms of what substantive impact this declaration might have on global emissions, but there are a couple of elements of it, as have already been mentioned, that are potentially quite significant if fully implemented. So certainly joint action on methane, and as Deb mentioned, this kind of deforestation, reducing deforestation through particularly restricting illegal lumber imports into China could potentially be significant, not only for emissions purposes, but also for protecting biodiversity. And I might just sort of put a little asterisk here to say that though lesser known sort of area of US-China environmental cooperation, the joint efforts to protect biodiversity around the world have been an important component of that relationship.
Thanks, Scott. That's great. And I'm especially glad that you mentioned the biodiversity point, because although this discussion mostly is going to be focusing on climate, we do want to acknowledge that there are broader areas in environmental protection which the US and China have worked on and may be able to continue to work productively in the future beyond our major topic today of climate. So we will come back to that. The other theme that I think we're going to try to highlight in the course of the discussion is that even though the series and this discussion is focused on the US and China, obviously climate change is a global issue with global ramifications, and there are many other dynamics in the world beyond just the US and China dynamic that are relevant to it. And so Xinlei, as I turn to you for your initial sense of the impact of the joint statement, how you read it, because you did your PhD in Germany, you're plugged into the European discussion on climate. I wonder if you can also, in your response, reference how you think the joint statement was understood and the reactions within the broader global community and certainly the European community.
Okay, I think the joint statement from United States and China can give the whole world a signal and a very strong confidence. That is very important, especially consider about the COVID-19 virus, and now the whole world need the more support and confidence from the 2 big powers, China and the United States. And I think they do not only send a strong signal to the whole world. Actually, the 2 countries, they have a lot of common interests, like we mentioned, like mentioned 1.5 degree target, and also both of them have published their ambitious clean energy development strategy. As we all know that climate change, the root for this problem is the energy consumption structure. Yes, both the two countries, they can also provide some solutions for the whole world. Like I mentioned that for example, the clean energy, they are very great solution for the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So the two worlds can the two states cooperation actually can just scale up the whole world's the energy transition, and also that will, like Tenfei mentioned, that we can promote some concrete cooperation, like some green technology cooperation. Although the two countries, like United States, China, sometimes when we mentioned their technological competition, but there are still some cooperative space for the two countries, because they can rally, for example, to solve some frictions of integration of WTO, some rules according with climate change, low carbon, and also clean technology standards. That is very important for the two big powers. They can promote also the joint statement is some kind of framework, but we also need some concrete institutional solutions, like in some green technology, and like the CCS, like the Manson, like the reforest fields. Okay.
Great. I think we have actually heard a lot of positive comments on the recent US-China joint agreement. But if we look at the broader US-China relations, maybe to some degree, unfortunately, climate change is maybe the only area we have some positive news. So I wonder, how do our four scholars here think about the role of climate change in shaping the broader US-China relations? Can we really count on climate change to be the sort of a savior of US-China relations? Even there is some sort of a competition, right, between US perspective and the Chinese perspective. For example, the coal issue is, I'm sure, a major source of difference between the two countries. So what do you think of the climate change role in shaping US-China relations? And looking forward to next year, 2022, and how much do you think we can make progress in this area as COP26 is gone? So what can we expect from the two countries? Maybe Deborah first.
So those are great questions. I don't think climate change is the savior of US-China relations. And I think it's been used that way too often in the past. It's like, let's just be friends on climate so that we don't have too much friction elsewhere. Climate's too important for that. We need to actually achieve our global goals on climate because the world needs us to. And we can't just sort of do things that make us happy or look like they are good for friendship without focusing on those goals. As I said in my recent New York Times op-ed, though, I don't think that actually requires that we always closely coordinate. I think as long as we have these shared mitigation goals, the real effort is going to be companies competing each other with each other to sell the best products at the best price. And I do actually think that's what's going to help the rest of the world. I mean, it's already the case that China's attempts to control air pollution, and in particular, putting things like scrubbers and nitrogen control equipment on their power plants, has driven down the price of scrubbers tenfold, which makes them much more affordable for India and Turkey and Vietnam and all the other countries that need to mitigate air pollution. Now, that has nothing to do with climate gases, but the reality is when Chinese companies jump into the worldwide competition for clean devices, it usually drives the price down because of just the massive production capacity. I'm hopeful that as the US puts more money into its own efforts, hopefully through President Biden's Build Back Better plan, some of it's now gotten stuck a little in the Senate, but half of it was already passed in the infrastructure bill. There's a bunch of great stuff on rail, on the electricity system, and on recharging of electric vehicles, that our companies will compete, and that this competition is going to be a big part of the story. You mentioned earlier carbon capture and storage, which I was lucky enough to work with Tsinghua on a project on that's now, what, 15 years ago? Time just keeps flying, right? So this has been clearly an important issue and is an important part of addressing the coal problem. And honestly, we share more on coal than we might want to admit, because we both have very poor parts of our countries that are very dependent on coal and very nervous about this transition. And so I think there's a lot of work we can do, which would be cooperative, on figuring out how to help transition these poor mountain areas that are very dependent. So I think there's collaboration that we can do, but I don't think that we need to feel that it's going to be in lockstep, in part because we already have the technologies we need. Of course, we can keep developing new ones, but it's not like the fact that we actually need some new vaccines in the public health area. If we deployed everything we had, we could solve this problem. So companies can do this. Thanks.
So that's a great point. You know, we don't need to have a very rosy U.S.-China relations, you know, to keep coordinating on the climate change issue. So, Professor Tenfei, from your Beijing perspective, how positive are you on this issue next year also?
Thank you. I think firstly, I agree with Debbie that we need to consider this US-China cooperation on climate change within the broader context of bilateral relationship, and especially the conflicts on technology and trade issues. Because of if we want to promote climate cooperation, we need to rely on technology and also the trade among those two countries. And secondly, I do feel optimistic on the future. The reason for this is because of firstly, that China and US need to work on technology cooperation, not only on the mature technology, but we also has the opportunity to work on some emerging technology which can bring us to the Paris Agreement goals, and especially those negative emission technologies. Two countries has little competition on this emerging technology market, but the IEA and also the IPCC shows we do need those negative emission technology to offset the residual emission from hard abated sectors. But those affordable negative emission technology is not there. And China and US can work together on that right now, and it should be political possible because of those technology is not political sensitive from my point of view. So that could be a leverage to change the current situation on broader technology cooperation and also the trade issues. So that is the reason that why I feel a little bit optimistic. And third one is, although there is some concerns on IPR, but I do think the previous successful experience on the energy and climate change cooperation on the CERC, the so-called Clean Energy Research Center between China and the US, has shown we do have the solution on the IPR issues, which can resolve concerns from both sides, and at the same time to promote the technology cooperation between China and the US.
Okay, thank you. Now, Scott, since you have worked with John Kerry before, and as we noticed, actually, John Kerry has been, in my view, the only senior level US official that has, traveled to China in person multiple times. Of course, there's COVID and all that and other issues, but still, we get a feeling John Kerry is kind of lonely within the US government, trying to promote maybe a more positive US-China relations. Do you think he's lonely? And how would the tensions in the broader relationship actually put this climate change cooperation in a more negative direction?
Thanks very much. Another excellent question, to which I think the short answer is yes. Although my sort of slightly longer answer would be, but John Kerry also wrote an op-ed before he took office in his current role, titled "America Can't Afford to Lose the Green Race with China," in which the basic argument was essentially a competitive one, that green technologies, clean technologies would power future growth, and that the United States could not afford to kind of fall behind China, which he argued was in fact happening. So I do think there's that sort of strain both to US policy on climate change as well as other issues in the US-China relationship. And that kind of leads me to just three kind of quick points, I think, in response both to your question as well as the previous one, which I think do have a lot of overlap. I think the first thing to say is that I believe the evidence is fairly clear that there's nothing kind of magical about climate change or other environmental issues that are going to improve the overall US-China relationship. I think there was that theory for a time during the Obama administration. I was there in the sort of latter part of it. We always talked about climate as the bright spot in US-China relations, which even at that time were kind of steadily worsening. And I think the evidence has sort of, come in that that as a sort of issue set, there's nothing magical about sort of the ability of both sides to cooperate on climate change that necessarily filters out or diffuses into other issue areas. I think the second point I'd like to make, which really picks up on Debbie's excellent comments, and I definitely encourage anyone who hasn't read her piece in the Times to do so. It's a very important piece of commentary. The thing I would maybe sort of add to that is, although we do have a lot of the pieces of the decarbonization puzzle in place technologically, we don't have all of them. We do need continued investment in research, development, and deployment, especially on the basic science side for certain technologies, particularly in those hard to abate sectors that Professor Tung mentioned. And that requires very often public expenditure from governments. In the American context, our history has shown that for better or worse, the idea of competition or response to perceived external threats is a really good motivator for Congress and for political leaders to support that type of public investment. And indeed, several pieces of legislation that have been passed variously by the House and Senate over the last 6 months or so explicitly name China as a sort of reason, and specifically competition with China as a reason for investment in some of these clean technologies. So, I don't want to sort of reach a judgment here about whether that's necessarily good or bad, but I think just as a practical matter, there's a very strong political motivation to seize on this idea of competition as a way to boost investment in some of these clean technologies that we desperately need to avert the climate crisis and decarbonize our economies, potentially even move actually toward taking more carbon out of the air than we emit into it by the time we're at the end of this century. I think that's where the science is increasingly pointing us. The other competition related issue that I'd point out is adaptation financing. You know, we've talked almost exclusively about mitigation, which is understandable, but the fact of the matter is, no matter what we do, we will be living, we already are living with some degree of climate change. There are millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world who are going to be really, really negatively impacted by that. We need to support them somehow. And a lot of that is going to have to come from essentially foreign aid or overseas development assistance, official development assistance. And again, I think at least in the American context, the idea of competing geopolitically and ideologically with China is a powerful political motive to boost that type of financing. And we are actually already seeing that with bodies like the Development Finance Corporation, a new-ish US development institution. The final point that I think I would make in all this is that although climate is currently, I would say, the sort of standout example of good ties and productive cooperation between the US and China, I think unfortunately we can't necessarily expect that to persist. I think one reason for that is that, as I mentioned earlier, we have on both sides leaders who are very personally invested in maintaining this relationship. They may not, be in office for too much longer in their current roles. I think the second factor we have to consider is that on both sides, there are constituencies who are not thrilled with this kind of US-China climate cooperation agenda. In the US, that's primarily on the right among conservatives. Within China, it's among officials and business leaders who think that climate and energy goals are being sort of advanced at too great a cost to job growth, to employment, to energy supply, and other sort of considerations. So we do have to keep in mind that there are constituencies who are not thrilled with this agenda and therefore do present some level of political risk to this continuing over time. I mean, obviously, I would say that risk is considerably higher in the US than it is in China, but it does exist in both countries, and that's something we should keep in mind.
Thank you, Scott, for raising several excellent points. I think we should really pay serious attention to. So, yeah, maybe Neysun, you wanna carry on with from a different angle?
Sure. The great piece by Deb in the New York Times has been cited a number of times, and I'm going to continue to cite it because it really is a very thoughtful attempt to see how there are competitive dynamics and cooperative dynamics that can coexist, and that take into account that there are things happening in both countries independently as well. And one of the things that Deb does in her op-ed is she mentions all the different ways in which China has made great progress actually on environment issues generally and on climate issues in particular in recent years, including very extensive reforestation and great reductions in its air pollution and in coal use. So maybe I think the next thing I want to do in our conversation is just to ask both Tongfei and Li-Shin Lei to speak a little bit more about what is happening on the Chinese side at the moment. We have these commitments that President Xi Jinping has made about achieving zero carbon by 2060, by also to reduce or to eliminate the use of the building coal-fired plants as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So maybe you could each, and maybe starting with Tongfei, say a little bit more about what is China's domestic agenda now on climate mitigation, and how much of that is driven by internal dynamics, and how much of it is shaped by either cooperative or competitive dynamics with the United States.
I think firstly that the domestic climate agenda right now is focused on to translate this climate neutrality target into an actionable plan that since the announcement of this climate neutrality target last year, the Chinese government are working hardly to design a comprehensive policy framework. We call it 1+N policy framework, that to make sure that we have the implementation plan that to translate that target into concrete action. This so-called 1+N policy framework contains one guideline policies which outline the milestone target for this carbon neutrality, especially for 2025 and 2030 and 2060 target. And the N generally is the including both the 2030 peaking action plan and also several sector action plan. And those action plan together will be the policy package which China will follow that to achieve both the 2030 peaking and 2060 carbon neutrality. And before the Glasgow conference, China just released the guideline documents together with the 2030 action plan documents. And in the next few months, the following sectoral action plan will be released to make sure that the 1+N documents as a whole policy package. Regarding to your second question, I think that the Chinese policy and target are both driven by a combination of domestic drivers and international drivers. For the domestic drivers, I think that is a combination of both the shift of the patterns to consider that to reduce climate change will not sacrifice China's economic growth, but also benefit China's economic growth. The old thinking is to cope with climate change and to reduce carbon dioxide will hurt China's growth of its economy. But the recent trend is the government began to buy in the idea that through the growth of the green industries that will bring the new engine to power China's growth and also to provide more jobs for China's growth. And that also will bring tremendous benefit in terms of air quality and also to reduce the economic losses due to the climate change in the long run. And in terms of the international drivers, I think that is a kind of leadership and performance issues for the Chinese government. And in terms of the leadership issues, that China would like to show its leadership in terms of the international governance, and climate governance is one of the places that China can play a central role in that regards. And also that China are willing to show the performance of Chinese political system and China's government that can provide the public goods to the whole world, which is a very important performance indicator for the Chinese government to show that the legitimacy of the Chinese government in terms of its political system. So I think that is both a combination of the driving forces from domestic and international perspective.
Xinlei, do you want to supplement any of that, including especially, I think, on whether the drivers are best understood in terms of domestic politics or in terms of international politics, or some combination of the two?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Tenfei. That is a combination of international driver and domestic driver. I'll give you example. For example, China issued its renewable energy law in 2005. The reason why issue this because the first we learn a lot from Germany, and especially since China joined the climate change negotiation. First, we treat climate change, change negotiation as some kind of a challenge, gradually. Yes, and thanks to the CDM, clean development mechanism, we realize that during the climate change can also bring us some, for example, some green economy development chance. We treat that as a very significant opportunity now. And at that time, you'll know that since 2007, China surpassed the United States as the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. Yes, we not only suffered a lot from the extreme climate weather. We also, since we are big agriculture country, yes, we also suffer a lot from the air pollution. Air pollution. Since that time, all the common people, we hope the government can do more, fight against about these things. So that's also, we have some domestic pressure and international pressure to do this. I want to add more that compared with the Western countries, China from the carbon peak 2030 to carbon neutral 2060, we have only 30 years to go. And for other countries like EU has I think the 70 years to go this road, and for United States maybe I think more than 40 years, and China it is a great pressure, and due to the great pressure, I think that can accelerate the energy transition, just at domestic level. And also within the domestic, we also have some different, for example, different intergroup, different voices. I think our national leader also make use of the international pressure to promote domestic like action plans or our policy package, especially in our 14th five-year plan.
Excellent. I think we have seen that in the Chinese case, maybe the difficulty is balancing economic growth and climate change reforms. What about the U.S.? What is the domestic story or context? We have heard about this Green New Deal. Do you think that's affecting the climate agenda? To what degree? And I wanted to ask Scott and Deb.
Sure.
Scott, please.
Thanks very much. I'll just offer a couple of thoughts. I think certainly it has affected the agenda quite significantly, both because the Green New Deal has sort of become the benchmark, not necessarily because everyone supports it, but I think it's sort of become the benchmark for climate and energy policy in the US, and the extent to which things are sort of at least implicitly measured as being more or less ambitious, maybe more or less reasonable in relation to the Green New Deal agenda. And obviously part of that too is that that's an agenda that originated with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is of course currently in power. And the progressive constituency is not necessarily dominant, but is certainly very influential in the Democratic coalition that again is in power. So I think certainly you have to say that's been very influential. That being said, I think the distinguishing thing about US climate and energy policy, looking back over the last 40 years, has been that it seesaws very dramatically, depending on which party is in power. And I think the kind of existential question facing US climate and energy policy is, can we expect to see that continue? If there's another change in administration or even a change in the congressional distribution of power in the upcoming midterm elections. I will say, sort of as a coda to that, I do think the needle is moving in US politics. On the Republican side, there is kind of a slow but nonetheless perceptible march in certain pockets of the party toward acceptance that we do need to do something about climate change. And, I think that something is still very much in doubt, but the progress part of that is that it was only a few years ago when, on the conservative end of the spectrum, the argument was whether climate change existed at all. And indeed, famously, whether it was in fact a Chinese hoax. So by that against that very low bar, I do think we can see some degree of progress. I think just as a sort of final point on that, a considerable part of whether the US climate and energy agenda proceeds, especially if there's a change in administration, does have to do with this sort of competition with China framing. And again, I don't want to necessarily defend that. I think it's, at least partly misguided in substantive terms. But certainly, I think just in terms of mobilizing political support, again, from a bipartisan perspective, for ambitious investments in clean technology and in climate and energy policy more generally, I do think that competition with China is one of the more potent political messages that's out there. So I think we can expect that kind of framing an issue to continue to run through US climate and energy policy, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Scott. Yeah, because I think about, the trade issue, right? Domestically in the US, there's a strong resistance to free trade, any sort of a free trade agreement, either from the Democratic side or from the Republican side. But now if you say, this going to help, you to compete with China, then, maybe there's more room for international free trade agreement. So climate might be similar to that. So Neysun.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I know that Scott's going to have to leave in a moment, so we're going to lose him in the conversation, which means we won't get to the broader biodiversity questions that he highlighted earlier. So we'll have to have another dialogue sometime to do that. But because Scott is leaving, I did want to acknowledge that and thank you for joining us, and then turn next to Deb, because Deb, really, we've talked about your op-ed so many times, but I think now is the time for you to kind of share the argument directly with the group, taking the cue that Scott just presented of the way in which competition with China is playing a role in our domestic politics on a range of issues, but especially on this climate issue, whether there is a healthy way for that framing of competition to play a useful role in terms of what we in the United States need to do on this climate issue.
So Neysun, I think I actually addressed that in my last set of comments, and I would really like to talk a bit about the question that Dingding raised about Build Back Better, because I think that's important. I would describe US policy over the last 40 years as actually more consistent than Scott suggested. While the position of the different administrations has varied greatly, the outcome in terms of the utter lack of federal legislation on anything climate related has been markedly consistent, right? And while the US has negotiated various environmental agreements under Democratic administrations, the refusal of the US Senate to ratify any new environmental agreements since 1993 has been consistent. And I think we in the United States can't give Democrats a free pass for their intentions, and we have to keep the pressure on our own government to actually deliver. And I will say that one of the big changes in the last 30 years has been the rise of state and local effort. And it is now the case that I believe more than half the US economy and about 40% of the population are under very strong state and local climate policies, even though at the national level, we don't have real climate policy. And the leadership in particular of California has been tremendous in this regard. The California-China Climate Partnership, I think, is now over 20 years old, and continues to be a major contributor. So I do want to highlight that, because that is a big difference between US and Chinese governance, is the freedom that our states and our localities have to kind of, if they want, within a certain reason, pave their own foreign policies, and certainly to pave their own domestic economic policies. And that's been a real saving grace for the United States, but not enough. And I think the important thing is, as Tang Fei really illustrated, in China, it's long been recognized that addressing climate change is a business opportunity. And in the US, that framing has not caught on. And there is a tendency to talk about costs rather than benefits. And whether it's talking about the cost of climate change itself, or whether it's talking about the costs of mitigation. And the problem with that is that when you only talk about costs and you don't talk about benefits, there's a tendency for pessimism and for people to just feel like they can't do anything. That means even people who are concerned are not focusing on solutions. And I think the real contribution of the Green New Deal type approach, which is now really encompassed in Build Back Better, is to shift the lens and talk about the benefits and talk about how transforming an economy into a clean energy economy is good for economics, it's good for people's health, it provides job opportunities, all these kinds of things. Now, this idea really started actually pre-Obama administration with the idea of green jobs, but I think it's finally caught on. And the shift away from talking about taxes to talking about spending in the United States is highly beneficial, and hopefully will finally get us toward a climate policy. As I said, there's more than people realize in the infrastructure bill that's already been passed. And hopefully in this next year, we'll get another set of heavy investments. And that really will enable the United States to compete more effectively on the world stage. And I do feel that one of the ways to resolve some of the tensions in the trade area, some of it is really going to be about Chinese practices, but some of it is also going to be about US confidence in competing. And so I do think that if Americans feel good about their own economy and own progress, that is an important step in the right direction.
Okay, thank you, Deb. I think you already made a very good suggestion about the future climate change in a cooperation between these countries. I think we are almost, time is up. And I think lastly, I wanted to ask each of us, from your perspective, what would be the most creative and the most effective way to promote US-China climate cooperation? So we need to think of some, plausible ways, concrete ways that we can move forward this cooperation next year and more so. So I'm going to start with Professor Tang Fei first.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are several ways we need to move forward. Firstly, as I have mentioned previously, we think we need to institutionalize this cooperation, not only through the working group, which very much focus on communication, but we need to establish something similar to the Clean Energy Research Center between China and the US, and to convene a group of both research institute and also company to work together and to establish the beneficial relationship between China and the US. And secondly, I think it's also important not only focus on the federal level cooperation, but also need to deep into the state level cooperation. The reason for that is, in fact, I think that from Chinese perspective, we also have the concerns on the political dynamics in the US, that if after the next election, we hope to avoid the instability of United States climate policy on this bilateral cooperation, because we think that this cooperation is vital, which will help not only to shift the bilateral cooperation in a healthy way, but also it's vital to accelerate the low carbon transition in the whole world, because of the focus is not whether or not we need to transform our economy and our energy system. The focus is the speed of that transformation. So only through the cooperation, we can accelerate the transition of both two countries and the whole world.
Thank you. Professor Li, how about you?
Okay, I think, yes, in the short run or in the long run, yeah, we still have several measures to improve the two countries' cooperation in climate and clean energy issue. Yeah, first, I agree with Professor Chen. Yeah, we should, yes, rebuild or innovate some institutional cooperation channels. Like we, in the past, in Obama administration, we have a US-China Renewable Energy Research Center, Renewable Energy Partnership, and also Energy Cooperation Program, and Clean Vehicle initiatives. So that is important, yes, to promote the two countries, yeah, the cooperation in a more institutional decision. The second, yes, I think the two countries can support each other, not only in a bilateral way, but also in a multilateral way. It means, yeah, in next year, in 2022, United States also will hold the Clean Energy Ministerial Conference, and also a Mission Innovation Conference. And for this two conferences, they all need the efforts and the contribution from China. The two countries can solve some frictions about the interpretation of green technology and also clean energy trade standards, and they can how to say, they can reshape, yeah, they can reshape the future global level green market. And the third one, I also think, yeah, the non-state actors play a significant role. For even in Donald Trump administration, and a lot of cities and states in United States, they promote the we are still in association to show the local climate leading position. And now, no matter how the two countries level relationships, I still think, the non-state actors and also the companies like the think tanks, they can promote the climate and clean energy cooperation in the long run. Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah.
So I want to pick up on a couple of the suggestions that Tongfei and Xinlei have made over the last discussion. First of all, going back to the discussion of removing carbon from the air, I think this kind of not yet ready for market technology, if we're going to think about where we can actually work together on technology, I think that's going to be the kind of area rather than things that are close to market. And I would also say that Xinlei's emphasis on non-state actors is spot on, because if we're going to succeed in the current environment, it's going to be by funding our academics and maybe our companies to work on this rather than a direct government to government. I honestly, in this environment, I do not see a revival of the clean energy research centers, which makes me sad because I was part of one, but Washington right now, I just don't see it, but I think there's a lot there, and especially a lot of the funding that Washington gives, those researchers go to China all the time, or at least did before COVID. And I do think that solving COVID travel problems and getting vaccinations worked out is as important as anything that we can do on climate change right now. But the other thing that I think I would pull a page from our public health experience with China on is, and picking up on Xinlei's point about multilateral, is working together in third countries may be a good way to collaborate and to really be very helpful. One of the things I have long felt is that China actually has one of the best models for disaster preparedness for a developing country, and honestly one we should look at in the United States, in terms of the paired counties approach to what happens when a typhoon hits. In China, everyone in every coastal county knows which interior county they can go to, and public buildings will be opened and cots will be pulled out by the Red Cross, and they will be given food and water. And as we've seen in many hurricanes in the United States, poor people don't know where to go. And this is an even larger problem in many developing countries. So I think actually having some serious conversations about what kinds of assistance in terms of adaptation that we can give in developing countries and some coordination there would be useful. And I do think Chinese development aid tends to focus on building stuff. And there's some soft policies like paired counties that I think could be a huge contribution. And I look at the success that the West Africa CDC, which was a joint project the US and Chinese CDCs have had in serving the countries of West Africa during COVID. And I think there's a lot there that we could do that wouldn't necessarily be in the direct commercial competition area, where I think, I mean, there are two things. One is I think we actually do have to compete because that's the way you drive down cost. And second of all, there's just a lot of tension there. So I just don't think it's going to happen. But I think we could improve what we do in ways that would be helpful to the world, while also actually let's focus on improving our own houses and having Americans pressure our own government and Chinese pressure their own government, because both of our governments do have to do better.
Thanks, Devin. You know, one of the things that I appreciated about your response now was that it sort of spoke to the point that both Tongfei and Li Xinlei made about how it'd be nice if our American political approach to this issue remains stable in the future. Of course, we know that there's a lot going on in our politics here now, and we cannot promise to you that the current administration's approach to these issues is going to remain. But I think what was very nice about Deb's points just now is she highlighted the importance of the private sector and other areas where things can happen in the U.S. outside of Washington. I should also highlight that Deb and her colleague Angel Shu from the University of North Carolina wrote a great pieces on subnational efforts on climate issues vis-a-vis China in our PEN project on the future of U.S.-China relations. So I hope people will take a look at that paper as well. But unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time today. There's so many threads to this conversation that I know both Dingding and myself would love to keep asking you all about. Maybe we should do another session with you all at some point in the future to update the story. But for now, I think we're going to end here and just thank all of you so much. Tangfei, Li-Xin Lei, Deb, and Scott, who had to leave early, for spending so much time with us this morning in the US, this evening in China, for this very important conversation.
Yeah, I want to thank all our guests for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I think now I'm more positive about the future cooperation prospects after hearing some of your, very creative and wonderful suggestions. So I do agree with Nathan. We should continue this conversation maybe sometime early next year when there is more maybe activity in this regard. So thank you again very much and hope to see you next time in person.
So for our listeners, that's the end, or our viewers, that's the end of our climate discussion part 1. And maybe we'll have a part 2 down the road.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll be back with more content soon.